Out on the low Dutch coast, the sea owned the land. Twice a day it rolled across the flat marsh and swallowed it whole. There was no high ground to run to, and nobody could outrun a tide on open mud. But people lived out there anyway, right on the drowning marsh for 1,000 years. They did not move inland. They did not wait for the water to win. Instead, they built their own hills, by hand, one basket of clay at a time, piled higher than the worst flood the sea could throw at them. The Frisians who built these mounds had a name for them. They called them terps. And the strangest part is this. Some of those hand-piled hills still stand today, with whole villages and stone churches sitting right on top. Tonight we are going to build one of these hills the way the Frisians did, problem by problem. Where you put your home when there is no dry ground at all. How you stop your own hill from washing away the first time the sea comes for it. How you find fresh water with salt on every side. And the one problem these mounds could never solve, the problem that finally forced an entire people to stop building up and start fighting back. How do you build a home on ground the sea takes back every single day? To even ask that, you have to picture the place these people chose. The Frisian coast of the northern Netherlands, before a single hand had touched it, was not really land and not really sea. It was salt marsh. Flat, treeless, soaked through with salt, flooding on the high tides and draining on the low ones, with no rise of ground anywhere in sight. To a modern eye, it is the last spot on earth you would put a house. There was nothing to climb when the water came, nothing to hide behind, just mud and sky and the tide. And yet they came, and they stayed, because that drowning marsh was hiding a fortune. The sea that flooded it twice a day was also feeding it, laying down a fresh skin of fertile silt with every tide. The grass that grew on that silt was some of the richest grazing in northern Europe, and for a people who lived off cattle and sheep, rich grass was worth more than dry feet. The land was the prize, the flood was the price. Settling there was a reckless bet, and for 1,000 years the people of Friesland and Groningen kept making it and kept winning. That bet only worked if they could answer one impossible question. How do you keep a home on ground the sea reclaims every day? Everything that follows is the answer, built one layer at a time. The first problem is the easiest to say and the hardest to fix. There is no high ground. So you make some. The earliest terps were modest things. A family would find a spot on the marsh that already sat a little higher than its surroundings. A natural swell of clay maybe a few feet up, and they would start adding to it. They cut sods of turf from the salt grass and stacked them. They dug heavy clay out of the marsh and heaped it on top. They piled it just high enough to lift one house and a few animals above the reach of an ordinary tide, and they moved their whole lives up onto it. For an ordinary high tide, that was enough. The water rose, lapped at the base of the little mound, and drained away while the family stayed dry on top. Problem 1, solved. Except the ordinary tide was never the thing that killed people. The first real storm surge would have shown them in one terrible night that a simple pile of dirt does not save anyone. Picture what a storm surge actually does. It is not a calm rising of the water. It is the whole North Sea, driven by a winter gale, slamming sideways into the coast for hours. A loose heap of clay and turf sitting in the middle of that should come apart like a sandcastle at high tide. The water tears into the base, undercuts it, and carries the whole thing away with the family still on top. So why didn't it? Because the terp was not a loose heap. This is the point where a pile of dirt quietly turns into engineering. The genius is in what it was made of. Pure sand would have drained and slumped. Pure clay would have cracked and slid. The Frisians built their mounds from a deliberate mixture instead. Clay for weight and density, cut turf laid in courses like brickwork, and the dung and waste of their own animals worked all the way through it. That mixture did something none of those materials could do alone. The roots in the turf knitted the layers together. The clay sealed them into a dense, heavy body that water could not easily soak into or wash out. And the whole outer face was left in living grass, a skin of tough salt marsh sod whose roots gripped the mound and armoured it against the waves. A terp under attack did not dissolve. It shed the water and held. Nobody stacking those first sods could have known it, but centuries later that one habit, building the refuge out of their own waste, would be the whole difference between a mound that held and one that washed away. But a mound that holds together solves the problem of standing up to the sea. It does nothing at all about the problem of the sea slowly getting taller. A terp was never built. It was always being built. Over the centuries a family lived there, the sea level slowly crept upward, and the storms kept testing the height of the mound. A terp that was tall enough for your grandfather was not tall enough for you, so every generation added to it. More clay, more sods, more of the daily waste of a working farm packed onto the top and the sides, lifting the houses a little higher each time. A mound that started as a low rise of a few feet could grow, across centuries of patient heaping, into a genuine hill. The tallest of them all, a mound called Hogebeintum, eventually stood as high as a small 3-story building, raised entirely by hand, basket by basket, by people with no machines and no engineers. That is a permanent condition. To live on a terp was to accept that part of your labour, every year, forever, went into the ground beneath your house. You were not maintaining a home. You were feeding a hill that could never stop growing, because the moment it stopped, the sea would catch up to it. And that was only half the never-ending work. There was a second job that never finished either, and it was the strangest one of all. A family living on a clay mound in the middle of a salt marsh had water on every side, and not one mouthful of it fit to drink. Salt water will not slake a thirst, it will not grow a crop, and it will kill the cattle the whole settlement was built around. Surrounded by an ocean, these people could die of thirst. They engineered their way out of that too. They dug pits and shallow ponds down into the body of the terp, shaped to catch rainwater and hold it. The Frisians had a name for these little freshwater ponds, the dobber, and they were as much a part of the mound as the houses on top. Rain fell, soaked down through the upper layers, and collected in the dobber, giving a household and its animals a fresh supply between the storms. They were drinking rainwater filtered through a hill made of their own dung and refuse. It sounds mad when you say it out loud. It was also clever, necessary, and it kept the whole arrangement alive through the dry stretches when no rain fell at all. A single bad summer with no rain could empty a dobby, and a settlement that ran dry on its own mound had nowhere left to go. So they dug more than one, and they kept them clean, because the pond on the hilltop was as much a matter of survival as the walls of the house. Picture the full weight of it now. These people raised their own hill, armoured it against the waves, kept raising it forever as the sea climbed, and carved their own water supply into the top of it. All of that just to stay in one place. Which raises the obvious question. What kind of life was worth that much work? Here the story takes the turn that surprises almost everyone. It turns out the families living on these heaps of clay and dung were not poor mud farmers clinging to the edge of the world. They were some of the great traders of the early medieval North Sea. Up on the mounds they built long timber halls and shared them with their animals under one roof. One end was the family's, with the hearth. The other end was the byre, where the cattle were stalled. In a treeless place with almost no fuel, the warmth of the animals helped heat the home, and when the water rose, every person and every beast you owned was already gathered on the high ground. During a flood, that shared roof was the whole point, and the sea that threatened them was also their road. Sitting between the river mouths of the continent and the sea lanes to England and Scandinavia, the Frisians turned the water into trade. Frisian woolen cloth was known across early medieval Europe, and Frisian merchants moved silver in serious quantities. Single farms grew into clustered villages sharing a ring of mounds, and from the air, some of those old village terps still show a wheel-shaped plan, a settlement on a hill that has no natural reason to be there. They did this not for a generation or two, but for an astonishingly long time. The first terps were being raised in the centuries before the birth of Christ, and people went on living on them and lifting them higher, straight through the Roman period and deep into the medieval centuries. By the High Middle Ages, they were so permanent that the people did something that tells you everything about how settled they felt. They built churches up there, solid stone medieval churches raised on the summits of the oldest and largest mounds, the highest and safest point for miles, so that the house of God stood literally above the reach of the sea. A stone church raised on a heap of clay and old dung. To the people who built it, there was nothing strange about that at all. These people made everything they needed with their own hands, out of what the marsh and their own animals gave them. Nothing was bought ready-made, and nothing was wasted. If that makes you want to put your own hands on the past instead of just watching it, that is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way store. It starts with the Medieval Bakery Collection, the practical recipes book for the dishes themselves, the sourdough manual for keeping a living leaven the old way, and the sourcing guide for finding real heritage grain. The bread is where this kitchen begins. But for all of that genius, there was one thing every one of these mounds could never do. All that building up could never do, the one thing that mattered most. It could not take the land back. Walk it through. A terp lifts your house, your barn, and your animals above the flood. It saves the family. But the fields, the grazing, the actual land you came here for, all of that stays down on the marsh, and every storm surge rolls straight over it. Salt water soaks the soil and poisons it. The sea reclaims the ground between the mounds again and again, and there is nothing at all a hill can do about it. You can lift the people out of the water forever. You can never lift the land. The terp, for all its cleverness, was a permanent defensive crouch. 1,000 years of endless labour that protected the family and surrendered the field. And there is a reason this is the part of the story that finally changed everything. Because around the year 1000, all that patient building up ran into a completely different idea, and the answer it produced was the exact opposite of everything the terp stood for. Instead of building up, you build out. The people of these coasts started connecting the high points with long banks of earth, throwing walls of clay between the mounds, and learning to ring whole districts with a barrier. The dike. And the dike answered the question the terp never could. Wall the sea out of an area completely, and the land inside it stays dry. The fields are saved, not just the farmhouse. You are no longer crouching above the water. You are pushing it back. Once you could ring the land with a dike and keep the flood out of the fields themselves, you no longer needed every single farm to sit on its own private mountain. The protected ground was dry. People could come down off the mounds and work the land directly. The terp quietly faded out of necessity and into habit. It did not vanish because the villages and the churches stayed exactly where they were, but the reason behind it dissolved. The mound that had been a matter of life and death became simply the old high part of town. The sea, of course, was not finished, and it made sure everyone remembered. The medieval North Sea coast was struck by floods so enormous they carry their own names and their own death tolls to this day. Great surges in the 13th and 14th centuries that smashed through the new dikes, redrew the coastline in a single season, and drowned tens of thousands of people. And on nights like those, the old wisdom of the terp came roaring straight back. When a dike failed, the people who lived to see the morning were very often the ones who could still scramble up the nearest ancient mound, the high ground their ancestors had piled up by hand for exactly this nightmare. The terp never truly retired. It went from being the front line against the sea to being the last resort when everything newer gave way. Walk the northern Netherlands today, and you are walking across this whole argument with the sea, whether you notice it or not. Dozens of towns and villages still sit on their terps. The streets climb a gentle rise for no obvious modern reason. The old church stands at the top. The whole settlement is quietly perched a few metres higher than the flat green farmland around it. At Hogebeinturm, in Friesland, the tallest surviving mound of them all, you can climb the terp, stand beside the medieval church on its summit, and look out over a country that lies lower than the spot under your feet. And the thinking behind that hill never went away. It only changed scale. Today, about a quarter of the Netherlands sits below the level of the sea, and a third of it would flood without its defences. That is a nation that has spent its entire existence answering one question: how do you live where the sea wants to be? The Dutch answer started with a single family heaping clay onto a marsh in the dark. It grew into mounds, then dikes, then the vast storm surge barriers that hold back the North Sea now. Every one of those is the same instinct as the terp, scaled up. Put the people above the water, or push the water off the people, and never assume the sea has given up. What endures is not a clever invention. It is a habit of mind, set down 2,000 years ago and never broken. The terp was just dirt, piled stubbornly higher than the flood by people who refused to leave good land to the sea. They did not outthink the ocean. They outlasted it, one basket of clay at a time. And the proof that it worked is that their descendants are still standing on those same hills today, dry, while the tide goes out and comes back in below them, exactly as it always has. We dig up the engineering the modern world walked past. Would you have built up or walked away? Subscribe and stay curious.